There's a big problem with music and film, music and live action film. The only truth I know about it is it usually doesn't work. Music may have more license in the animated film in the same way that it does in the theater, simply because the level of reality is different. There's no game being played by a theater audience. We know that's happening right in front of us, and it's painted scenery and it's not real. When we go to the movies, it's a real street, or it looks a lot more like a real street. And we pretend it may be really happening.
In this clip, the late great Howard Ashman was discussing the power of music in animated film. While he worked at Disney, he became a pioneer in the world of animated musicals, with this philosophy serving as the backbone of how he approached his work, with many of the live-action musicals of recent decades doing more and more to prove his point. But today I want to stretch this idea a bit further and make the claim that musicals aren't the only part of storytelling that just work better in animation. See, the thing about animation is that the worlds it creates are inherently limitless, and no matter the style of animation, because it is so upfront about the fact that it is fake, audiences are more willing to believe and accept the many stranger choices an animated show or film may make. So it really is a shame that more and more it seems that animation is being pushed into the realm of realism by Hollywood, or by the animation megagiant Disney at least, but even outside of Disney, many animation companies tend to stick to similar design principles with their animations. Realistic proportions, worlds that look like, with a fresh coat of realistic textures, they could be real, and colors that just make sense. Let's switch gears here. There was an art movement, and I know the term isn't fully accurate describing this, but that's not important here, that developed around the 20th century called Expressionism. Quote, Expressionism is considered more as an international tendency than a coherent art movement, which was particularly influential in the beginning of the 20th century. It spanned various fields: art, literature, music, theater, and architecture. Expressionist artists sought to create emotional experience rather than physical reality. You know some of these painters, even if you don't associate them with this term. Then, after World War I, many German filmmakers started to gain an interest in these aesthetics, and experimented with bringing them to life on the big screen. One of the first being The Student of Prague from 1913, and most famously Nosferatu in 1922, kicking off what we now call today German Expressionism. Due to the more traumatic start of the movement from World War I, a lot of these films tended to skew towards horror. Actually, pretty much all of the films of the movement were horror. The rise of Nazi Germany and the ousting/fleeing of pretty much all the major filmmakers put a pretty abrupt end to the movement, but the tendencies of it never really went away. According to the paper Shadows Illuminated, Understanding German Expressionist Cinema Through the Lens of Contemporary Filmmaking Practices, by Gerald Saul and Christine Els, quote, by the mid-30s, most of the members of the Expressionist film community had relocated first to France and then to Hollywood, and, quote, the revolutionary style could be formulated along the lines of, if you can't beat them, change the rules, as said by director Robert Wine. Artists discovered that there is another reality of the photographic plate, different from that of the human eye, and concluded that Expressionism places the soul above nature. Essentially, Expressionism became very popular in the US after a lot of German filmmakers brought the practice here, going so far as to define the entire early US horror scene and birth its own subgenre of film noir. Influences that are still clearly felt today in films like Blade Runner from 1982 by Ridley Scott and Batman 1989 by Tim Burton. So there's really no discussing the intersection of German Expressionism and animation without looking at Burton. Tim Burton is a German Expressionist filmmaker, plain and simple. He uses the aesthetics of it in nearly all of his films and calls on many films, like Metropolis, as his inspirations. I don't care that he has his own term. In fact, I hate the term Burton-esque. It feels like we're trying to award him for inventing something that's already been invented and, in my opinion, perfected. The major thing that makes his work deviate from the traditions of German Expressionism is his use of Victorian sensibilities in his characters, and the fact that now, no matter how much you may argue against the notion, he's no longer a non-conformist filmmaker. In an article by P.C. Kuhns called The Use of German Expressionism and American Exceptionalism, he states, quote, Tim Burton has an ability to adopt subversive styles and incorporate them into mainstream products without impairing their potential for success. Despite German Expressionism's often counter-hegemonic intentions, its stylistic complexity often alienated the group it aimed to awaken and inspire. Burton's appropriation demonstrates one incarnation that attempts to marry avant-garde aesthetics with the studio's necessity for popular consumption. While it might not spark a revolution, it does work to undermine the stale conventions that continue to anesthetize the mainstream audience by reifying the values and practices of the dominant ideology. End quote. He isn't the only one to adopt this aesthetic in his animated films either. Prior to Burton, German Expressionist influences were always there in animated features. Most notably, in Disney's Snow White, as Snow is running for her life in the woods, she's followed by warped trees and exaggerated faces. His contemporary, Henry Selick, has, as I would argue, more of an influence in the stop-motion sphere of German Expressionism by the way he put together the visuals for Nightmare Before Christmas, Coraline, and even more so with Wendell and Wild. So I keep bringing up these German Expressionist aesthetics and design choices without really talking about them. According to Two Bridges NYC, German Expressionism can be visually defined by the use of non-conventional lines that were, quote, often chaotic and went against the ordinary shapes that highlighted order in the world, as if to depict the state of affairs at the time, which were far from calm or normal, end quote, and makeup looks that dress their antagonists in, quote, pale makeup to conceal the emotion on their faces, with dark eyeliners making them appear more threatening. They kind of look like mimes, notable for the absence of primary colors and basically other vivid shades in their costumes, end quote. A sense of overacting was also prevalent in these films, though. In fairness, a lot of silent films use the sort of thing to get emotion across. The styling of German Expressionism just heightened this use of acting, this acting style. Filmmakers also often used, quote, camera tilts that were nigh insane to bring more of the strange lines and shapes into the frame, and also to add to the character's delusions or state of mind. High angles and unexpected camera positions enhanced the depth of the set and messed with the audience psychology, end quote. Basically, it was weird, over-the-top, almost campy in places, and one of the most unique experiences an audience could get. Even among the other German expressionist contemporaries, you'd be hard-pressed to find them adhering to the same rules or creating worlds that looked in any way similar. But now I have a question that not many people are asking. Why is it that German Expressionism is so closely tied to horror today? Obviously, the historical shadows of the World Wars held a huge impact on how it developed and was used. And due to those associations, this genre has been the go-to for German Expressionist filmmakers today. But when I look at even more contemporary films that use those influences, all I see are horror, occasional noir, and films that are going for a spooky look without the commitment of horror as a genre. And F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, which has a woman almost drowning and dying like twice, so I don't really know if that counts. But more importantly, every single animated film that uses German Expressionism uses it strictly for horror. And I think that's a waste. To go back to the start of all of this, animation has the ability to make the weirdest styles feel normal. We accept what is put on the screen with very little pushback, so why don't more animated films use German Expressionism outside the context of horror? Animation is a mode of filmmaking that is practically begging to be pushed to its limits. It craves unique takes on how a world should work and how it should function. The very purpose of German Expressionism is to push the limits of style, to create a world that can never exist in real life, and then use that world to reflect the inner emotions and workings of the characters. How are the two not a match made in heaven? The only place I've seen this done outside of horror is in Gwen Stacy's universe in Spider-Verse, and it was amazing. Why can't we put more of our focus into creating a world that not only looks unique, but also decides the world doesn't have to make sense because no one's really asking it to? This is a form of storytelling that I think we can make better when we use it in animation. Much like Ashman's musicals, I think the warped and twisted sensibilities of German Expressionism can be brought to even greater heights when used in new and experimental contexts. To put it in metaphor, cowboy boots were made for the desert, but try convincing me they won't work even better in snow. Just imagine what we could create if we decided the worlds we designed are made less to make sense and more to explore our characters. If we decided that a warped, bent wall, over-the-top acting, and makeup choices that would put a clown to shame were useful because it made our stories more interesting to look at, rather than because it made sense. In conclusion, I think that German Expressionism and animation need to be used together more often, because I think that would make our art more unique and expressive and allow us to create new visual vocabularies that we can use to say more with about our stories.